Welcome back. And big thank you to the folks here for lunch and from Sister Kathy. It was a wonderful lunch. I thought before we begin, I might like to do another musical meditation in just a moment. You won't be required to sing this time, but I want to just go back for a minute to this slide. When I first saw this image, I was just dumbstruck. It's one of the very few drawings that Merton put a title on. Almost none of his drawings have titles. This one does. And it's called Christ Unveils the Meaning of the Old Testament. There's a wonderful study that a scholar, Merton scholar, a sister, I think, Margaret Bridge Betts, I think, or what did she was trying to track down the date of this image, when it was drawn, and she had a hard time pinning it down, but her best guess was this image was drawn in the early 1950s. I would have guessed, had I not read her article about it, that it was late or even in the 60s, after all this Sophianic material comes into his consciousness, but it was before that, evidently. So it seems to me that this something was emerging in him over many years, and there was an intuition there, even as early as the early 1950s. It's a really striking image. The original hangs on the wall at the archives in Louisville at Bellarmine University, and it's probably about this big. And Margaret Betts interviewed. She brought the image to some art critics and historians, and she got some input about their interpretation of it. Anybody want to comment on what you see in the image, and then I can tell you what she notices. You can see his scratching down in there in the right corner is where the title is. Yeah.
The eyes.
So, eyes.
Jesus' eyes are kind of slits, and wisdom's eyes, or the Old Testament, they're open, they're full, they're written.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I'm thinking he might have had to. What is the title again?
Christ Unveils the Meaning of the Old Testament.
He would almost have had to title that because is he unveiling or veiling? That's right. Look at the hands. Look at the
I
veil.
see. Yeah.
So it's a little the Picasso hands and flowers. It's him giving them to clean. So I wonder if that would be why he titled it.
Mm-hmm.
But once he looked at it himself, he said, "Oops."
Yeah. He wouldn't want you to interpret it as a veiling. Rather, it's an unveiling. Yeah, that's an important point. I think you're right. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Well, take it literally. The Old Testament is home.
How about that? It's not the usual image that comes to mind when you think of the Old Testament. Yeah. Her eyes, the freshness, the youthfulness, the wide openness, whereas Jesus, as she wrote in her article, appears to be older and somewhat weary. There's a weariness that life has worn him down, something like that, and also typically when you have Jesus and a woman, he's usually in the foreground. The Madonna and Child, for example, Mary's behind and Jesus is in the foreground. Here it's reversed, and there's almost the opposite of it's really the opposite of the kind of the great Christian sin of supersessionism, which is to veil the Old Testament and say we are the new covenant. And so if you think of it theologically in that way, that Merton is reversing that. It's really provocative to suggest that the deepest, perhaps the deepest, there's something that is there that Christ is unveiling. That is so there's the deep continuity between the Christian and the Jewish narrative, but she's the one who appears on the scene as the new, with a freshness, a vigor, the vitality of life, and all that goes with that the wisdom material in the Bible. One other point that some others have made is, and I may be in Margaret's article, that those who knew Margie, so the woman he fell in love with in the spring of 1966, say she looked a lot like this. She's a long-haired, dark-haired Irish girl. And, you know, when you look at this image, there's a resemblance. Interesting. So. Yes?
Also, ancient women would have to veil their hair, right? Hair is a symbol of vulnerability or exposure. So there's a sense of vulnerability there, too, tied to wisdom, perhaps?
Yeah.
That's the first thing when I first saw the image. I was shocked how exposed her hair was.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you. I mean, that theme of vulnerability is so important in, I think, in love, of course, and in the notion of poverty of spirit, of surrender to the other, of removing the false masks, what Merton called the false self, and which is not easy to do. But it's a wonderful insight.
Could it be that it's Mary? Mary, his mother, is the daughter of God the Father?
Mary, say again, please.
Mary is the daughter of God the Father, the mother of God the Son, the spouse of God the Holy Spirit.
Mm-hmm.
Could it be Mary?
I suppose Mary, and Mary is daughter of the Jewish people as well, which is very rich in the Russian material. That is to say, so I think the answer is yes, and yes, and yes, and yes. All of these things. But what's so beautiful when you read the Russians, and when you read Hagia Sophia, I think, and I'll reflect on this a little bit more in a few minutes, but that fiat in Mary, her yes, that word fiat, yes, let it be done to me, was long prepared in her by the Jewish people. That she was raised in a people who had this covenant relationship, who were deeply attuned to the movement of God in their midst, you know, in the desert, right? And all through their history, this notion of being attuned to God's presence and saying yes when we're called in the moment to participate with God's plan for the world, for creation. And very strong in the poem as well as in the Russian material is a reclaiming of Mary's Jewishness, Joseph, Christ's Jewishness. Not so much in the poem, it's not explicit there, but in the background material of the Russian writers. Two other quick points about the poem. Earlier, when I read that last passage, and I said it was the last stanza of Hagia Sophia, I was mistaken. What I read was from, I think, the second movement of the poem. The last stanza is worth just looking at briefly. So the whole fourth section, which is Sunset, the Hour of Compline, Salve Regina, is really a beautiful section about Sophia being unveiled in Mary and her fiat, her yes. And here you might picture Victor Hammer's image of the woman behind Christ. It is she, it is Mary, Sophia, who in sadness and joy, with the full awareness of what she is doing, sets upon the second person the logos, a crown which is his human nature. Thus her consent opens the door of created nature, of time, of history, to the Word of God. God enters into his creation through her wise answer, through her obedient understanding, through the sweet yielding consent of Sophia. God enters without publicity into the city of rapacious men. She crowns him not with what is glorious, but with what is greater than glory. The one thing greater than glory is weakness, nothingness, poverty. She sends the infinitely rich and powerful one forth as poor and helpless in his mission of inexpressible mercy to die for us on the cross. And now this last stanza. Remember, the poem has opened in a hospital room at dawn with an awakening. The narrator of the poem awakens to the sweet touch of the nurse, the cool, as he puts it, the cool hand of the nurse. And the poem here closes with surrender to sleep. So the poem is bookended by an awakening and then a surrender to sleep. And notice the merging of the narrator with the figure in the final stanza, who is kind of a haunting image of a Christ figure, a strangely modern Christ figure who is homeless. The shadows fall, the stars appear, the birds begin to sleep. Night embraces the silent half of the earth. A vagrant, a destitute wanderer with dusty feet finds his way down a new road. A homeless God, lost in the night, without papers, without identification, without even a number. A frail, expendable exile lies down in desolation under the sweet stars of the world and entrusts himself to sleep. So the word vulnerability, surrender, trust, poverty of spirit. The Christology here, the image of Christ implied, is quite striking and beautiful, of Jesus himself as surrendering himself to the vulnerability of what it means to be a human being, walking the earth, not knowing everything about where your path is leading you, but entrusting oneself night after night after night, morning after morning, as you rise again in the morning, to the presence of the Shekinah, of God, of God's Spirit, of wisdom. I just wanted to, if you haven't had a chance yet to meditate on the poem, the opening and the closing, I think are very striking kind of bookends in terms of a spirituality of accompaniment and presence and surrender to and trust to our relational dance with God, if you will. Anything else? Maybe carrying over from the earlier sessions that you'd like to say, or shall we listen to a little music? I want to share. So in this next session, I want to go further with the Sophia material and look for signposts of her presence, perhaps in the world today. So I'll do that in a moment, but I want to begin with a little musical meditation. This is a song by a cello player named Eugene Friesen, and he for many years played in a group called the Paul Winter Consort, and I think he still does actually. And his friend Paul Haley, who plays piano, so it's cello and piano. The two of them had played for years in the Paul Winter Consort, but never just the two of them. Well, deep in the winter, this is way back in 1986, I think, they finally said, we've got to get together and just record some, play together, just the two of us. And they managed to make arrangements to one night to go to St. John's Cathedral of the Divine in New York City. Just the two of them with their instruments and a recording engineer, thankfully for us. Because what happened that night is just extraordinary. They didn't rehearse this music. They never rehearsed it. I have to presume they had some charts or something, but deep in the night, they just sat with their instruments in the darkness with just enough light on their instruments so that they could see each other and the recording engineer there with them. And if you can picture yourself, say, up in the choir loft, looking down on this, I'm going to play the last song on the album, which is called Full Circle. And I just invite you to listen and take a ride on the music. It begins in perfect silence, so just invite you to still yourself and really listen carefully as it begins. You'll hear the cello, but just very quietly as they begin to play. What do you think? Me too. Anybody want to comment on?
Just two become one. One becomes two. Not one, not two.
Becomes many.
Mm-hmm. We are one silence and a diversity of voices. Yes. Mm-hmm.
They're moving together, and they're not waiting for one another to say something. They're so one, that they're able to lead the conversation, just so perfectly, and respond, to the loudness and softness and the vibration.
And it almost felt like they couldn't stop. Did anybody else hear that? It's like I thought they were going to, and then they went back up again, and then, it was almost like they couldn't stop.
Something kept drawing them forward. This image of a dance, perhaps. Yeah, one leading and then the other following, and then vice versa. Kind of just totally attuned to each other's every movement. I often thought of the hours, the months, the years as a piano player, as a kid growing up. Practicing scales, all those dreadful days. The discipline required to learn an instrument, and a great deal of loneliness or solitude in just learning the piano, learning an instrument. But that all of that labor prepares them for this moment when they're together to respond perfectly to each other. They don't have to think about playing anymore. The mastery of the instrument. They've so mastered the instrument that they're able to respond spontaneously, freely, completely to one another. And they create something just beautiful out of nothing. And yet not nothing. They bring them their whole selves, all those years of discipline, but something happens in that moment that never was before. It seems to me a pretty good metaphor for the spiritual life. As Merton called it, the general dance. The moments of solitude, and there are real moments of dark nights and of loneliness, when the prayer life is exceedingly dry and dull and boring, and just nothing is happening, no sense of presence, and yet we show up. We just keep showing up, and then when we're drawn into relationship, perhaps we're better prepared to respond in the moment to the person or the place that we're in at this moment. I had some students. I played this for my students one time, and I have many times, but one time I'll never forget when I asked the students, "Well, what do you think?" There was a baseball player in the room, big kid. He stood up and he said, "It's a fucking miracle." And I think he's right. It's exactly right. Yes.
Kind of thinking about this, and the title of the album is New Friend. And thinking, my son is a drummer, and he and his drummer friends get together. They got together at the chapel at Rosemont, and they did an improv. And it was exactly like that. It was that conversation. And then the word that really kind of comes to mind is actually communion. That is exactly what kind of comes to mind. You can't have that kind of a relationship with strangers. You have to be friends. Like there has to be that sort of relationship, that sort of communion that you have with each other. So that's kind of what's hitting right now about all of this.
Right. Yeah. And in the context of their friendship, right? They feel each other's every gesture. It's really, really fabulous. And if they were to do this again, it would be different. It'd be wonderful, perhaps, but this is just, it's just staggering. Anybody else? No. Well, I'd like to again. I want to reflect on Wisdom-Sophia as perhaps gestures, hints and gestures of her presence in our world today, and as Merton gestures himself, awakens us. I want to begin, though, with a quote from a remarkable person whose story I think many of you will know, who is Father Alfred Delp, who was a Jesuit priest who was executed on February 2nd, 1945. Late in the war, really late, was arrested and executed by the Nazis in February of 1945 for his resistance. And in a letter to his friends from prison, I have this for you on page 6. Father Delp wrote about the beauty and the cost so hearkening back to Merton's struggle in 1961, of the difficulty of being a person of conscience in a season of fury, and finally surrendering in trust to God. Father Delp wrote about the beauty and the cost of a life lived ever more freely under the horizon of grace. If we keep in mind the historical and anguishing personal context in which these words were written, they intensify all the more, I think, the theme at the heart of our gathering this morning and this afternoon, which is the theme of hope, hope rising. Where does hope rise? Father Delp writes, "One thing is clear and tangible to me in a way that it seldom has been. The world is full of God. From every pore, God rushes out to us, as it were. But we're often blind. We remain stuck in the good times and the bad times and don't experience them right up to the point where the spring flows from God. In everything, God wants to celebrate encounter and asks for the prayerful response of surrender. The trick and the duty is only this: to develop a lasting awareness and a lasting attitude out of these insights and graces, or rather, to allow them to develop. Then life becomes free in that freedom which we have often looked for. The witness of mystics, sages, prophets, and ordinary people of faith right down through the ages suggests that rising up from within creation, there pulses an uncontainable love, coming toward us in all things. Indeed, their witness says to us, God rushes out to us from every pore. But can we believe it? This, I think, is Thomas Merton's particular gift. He helps us to believe it. Or better, he helps us to feel it, and therefore to feel hope, which is the capacity to be able to imagine again. In a nutshell, this is my thesis. Hope in the key of wisdom awakens that freedom which we have often looked for, drawing us into the future of God's own imagining. From the poem, at 5:30 in the morning, I am dreaming in a very quiet room when a soft voice awakens me from my dream. I am like all mankind awakening from all the dreams that ever were dreamed in all the nights of the world. It is like the one Christ awakening in all the separate selves that ever were separate and isolated and alone in all the lands of the earth. It is like all minds coming back together into awareness from all distractions, cross purposes, and confusions into unity of love. It is like the first morning of the world when Adam, at the sweet voice of wisdom, awoke from non-entity and knew her, and like the last morning of the world when all the fragments of Adam will return from death at the voice of Hagia Sophia and will know where they stand. The lure of Wisdom-Sophia in Merton's corpus is just this, a lure, if I can borrow a rather mundane fishing metaphor. Picture a lure, a fishing lure, if you will, from the fish's perspective. You see it flashing and dancing and singing in the waters just out in front of you, inviting and drawing you forward. She is God's call from the future, breaking ever into the present. And just when you think you've got her, lunging forward and capturing her in your teeth, you find that it is you who have been gotten by her. She captures you, your whole self, and will not let you go. We style ourselves as the ones pursuing, and discover with a jolt that it is she, God herself, who initiates and sustains the pursuit from before the very beginning. She is the love of love itself in the heart of God, spilling over into the creativity of life, unfolding over deep, deep time. Perhaps she is more like the water itself, that bears and animates both fish and lure, not that which we see, but that through which we see. As Thomas Aquinas put it, that God is not that which we see, but that through which we see. The veil of love and light enlivening all things. And still she dances and sings before you, shining from within all things, refusing to be domesticated. This morning I called Merton an artist, a sacrament maker, and yet I qualify. It is God the artist, the gift of the Creator's thought and art, who speaks in and through Merton. In Hagia-Sophia, Merton is like the poet Lurie in Zhivago's, in Pasternak's Dr. Zhivago. The poet Lurie, who Merton celebrates in the novel, who, quote, felt that the main part of the work was being done not by him, but by a superior power that was above him and directed him. And he felt himself to be only the occasion, the fulcrum, needed to make this movement possible. End quote. For me and for countless others, Merton's writings have been a kind of fulcrum, making a little more possible in our lives the movement of spirit between heaven and earth, matter and spirit, freedom and grace. Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, the head of the Church of England, who is himself an astonishingly sensitive poet and theologian, he reinforces this point, I think, about Merton when he says, rather more provocatively, he likens Merton at his best to, as Williams put it, Merton is like the poverty of the priest who vanishes into the Mass. Merton's genius, says Williams, was largely that he was a massively unoriginal man. He is extraordinary because he is so dramatically absorbed by every environment he finds himself in. America between the wars, classical pre-conciliar Catholicism and monasticism, the peace movement, Asia. In all of these contexts, he is utterly priestly, says Rowan Williams, because Merton is utterly attentive. He does not organize, dominate, or even interpret much of the time, but responds. And all of these influences flow into one constant place, a will and imagination turned Godward, end quote. Now, this is a point really worth pondering. How many of us would think to describe Merton as a massively unoriginal man? What is Williams driving at here? The great Christian, he continues, is the man or woman who can make me more interested in God than in him or her. Merton is a great Christian because he will not let me look at him for long. He will finally persuade me to look in the direction he is looking, toward a world everywhere haunted by God. I don't want to know much more about Merton, Williams confesses. He is dead, and I shall commend him regularly, lovingly, and thankfully to God. I am concerned to find how I can turn further in the direction he is looking, in prayer, poetry, theology, and encounter with the experience of other faiths, in trust and love of God our Savior." End quote. Now, for all the fascination and inspiration Merton's life story has been to me, I basically agree with Rowan Williams that being interested in Thomas Merton is not being interested in an original, a shaping mind, but being interested in God and human possibilities. End quote. Thus, for me, the question of Wisdom-Sophia in Merton's life is not primarily a psychological question, though it is surely that. Nor is it a strictly literary and poetic question, though it is certainly that. At its core, it is the question of God, which many others of his time were asking and which people today are asking with great urgency. Where is God? Who is God? Or simply, is God? And if God is, why is the world in such a damn mess? More precisely, how do we distinguish the true God, the one who is real and trustworthy, from the idols of death of our time? Now, this is the most serious of questions. And yet, somehow with Merton, when I read Merton, it feels like also a very playful question. Not so serious. That is, it is very serious in Merton, but it's also playful, as we saw this morning. He invites us into a kind of a dance around the question of God and of God's presence. In fact, Rowan Williams has a little essay called on Merton and Karl Barth, the great Protestant theologian, which is called On Not Being Serious. It's a wonderful essay, and he teases out this playfulness both in Merton and Barth around the question of God. The poet and Merton scholar Susan McCaslin, whose work I depended on quite a lot in writing my own study of Sophia, in her wonderful exegesis of Hagia Sophia, Susan McCaslin observes that Merton was aware that the Sophia tradition had been marginalized within Western Christianity. And with Hagia Sophia, he attempts to restore it, so to bring back this tradition into the West. Now, this much is very clear and quite significant to me, that Merton sought to retrieve a memory and experience of God largely lost in the West, and at great price. Yet for me, an even more significant assertion follows when Susan McCaslin writes, quote, "While Merton recognizes the limitations of language, he assumes a metaphysical and ontological ground of being beyond language, that is, the real presence of wisdom behind and within the signs." Now, I pondered that assertion for a long time. What can it mean? Here the question of language interjects. Is Merton just painting pretty pictures with language in the poem? She says, no, that he's assuming a real presence of wisdom behind and within the signs of language. When Jesus of Nazareth prefaced his enigmatic sayings and parables with the words, "Let those with eyes to see and ears to hear and see," scholars tell us he was speaking as a teacher of Jewish wisdom, appealing not just to the head, but to the whole person of the listener, body, mind, heart, senses, imagination. Like a lure, his words dance before our imagination, breaking open our habitual assumptions about the way things are. This, too, is Merton's gift, and it is not necessarily an easy or pleasant gift to receive, neither from Jesus nor from Merton. To be born again, that is, to break free of the stultifying womb of conventional wisdom, the assumed way things are in society, in church, is to risk the vulnerability of a faith that holds no guarantees. Listen to the silence. Hear the forgotten histories. Let the music of things unseen and hidden speak to you, awaken you from your slumber. Nothing is impossible with God. Can you believe it? Now the wisdom of God from the poem Sophia comes forth, reaching from end to end mightily. She wills to be the unseen pivot of all nature, the center and significance of all the light that is in all and for all. But she remains unseen, glimpsed only by a few. Sometimes there are none who know her at all. The imagination that bears hope in the key of wisdom, sees promise rising in life itself and in life's protest. The sacred longing for life and communion that pulses in the very substance of things, beckoning our freedom forward, daring us to imagine and make room for another possible future. By contrast, the imagination that produces despair and world-weary cynicism is like a tightening barbed wire circle, a series of closing doors that promise nothing new, but only more of the same horizontal flight across the dull surface of history. Despair cannot see beyond or imagine a way out. It infuses life with a dread weariness. And still she dances before us. Sophia, the feminine child, is playing in the world, obvious and unseen, playing at all times before the Creator. All of this is to suggest that Merton is not just painting pretty pictures in Hagia Sophia. Immersed body and soul in the tradition, he writes as a mystical theologian, a poet of the presence of God. His task is not to defend the traditional understanding of God, but rather to articulate a mode of divine presence responsive to the crisis of his times, a mode of presence faithful to the revelation of God and humanity, fully alive in Jesus, but if real and authentic, a mode of divine presence, a kind of God talk, that is, a theology, that will resonate in a key familiar to others even beyond Christianity and the Catholic Church. His task is to awaken hope. To grasp the real presence of wisdom implies no magic, literary or otherwise. It does imply that we, like Merton, have to learn patiently and prayerfully to read the signs of our own times with penetration. So for the next few minutes, if I could leave Merton behind and invite you to join me in a kind of experiment in Sophianic imagination. In the spirit of Rowan Williams' call to turn further in the direction that Merton is looking, I'd like to chase after the lure of Wisdom-Sophia in other places, and particularly in the Jewish community, a community of critical importance to Merton in the last decade of his life. And of course, the memory of the Jewish people is painfully replete with the problem of God. Where was God through these unspeakably dark passages of the 20th century? I'd like to begin with the witness of a young Jewish woman named Etty Hilsum, whose story intensifies the question of God during the Holocaust. Her story and the stories of other women like her compel us to ask not only where was God, but perhaps more significantly, who was God? Who was God during the Shoah, or Hebrew for Holocaust, or the catastrophe, the Shoah? Etty Hilsum, I have her picture there. There's some wonderful pictures of her that just bring alive her youthful vitality. She was a Dutch Jew who lived in Amsterdam during the Nazi occupation and was murdered in Auschwitz at age 29. How many of you have read from her diaries or Wonderful. A great many of you. Her diaries, which survived the war, give witness to a spirit in humanity that defies rational explanation. In May of 1942, just before Eddie was arrested and sent to the transit camp of Westerbork, she wrote the following passage in her diary, lines that have haunted me since I first read them some 25 years ago. Can I ask somebody to read from this passage at the top of page 6, Saturday morning, 7:30? It's in the back of the room. Can somebody bring the microphone over?
The bare trunks that climb past my window now shelter under a cover of young green leaves, a springy fleece along their naked, tough, ascetic limbs. I went to bed early last night, and from my bed I stared out through the large open window, and it was once more as if life, with all its mysteries, was close to me, as if I could touch it. I had the feeling that I was resting against the naked breast of life and could feel her gentle and regular heartbeat. I felt safe and protected. And I thought, how strange. It is wartime. There are concentration camps. I know how very nervous people are. I know about the mounting human suffering. I know the persecution and oppression and despotism and the impotent fury and the terrible sadism. I know it all. And yet, at unguarded moments, when left to myself, I suddenly lie against the naked breast of life, and her arms round me are so gentle and so protective, and my own heartbeat is difficult to describe, so slow and so regular and so soft, almost muffled, but so constant, as if it would never stop. That is also my attitude to life. And I believe that neither war nor any other senseless human atrocity will ever be able to change it.
Thank you. Would you like to comment? Robert Ellsberg, who has, in his book All Saints, has a section on Eddie Hilsum, comments, for Eddie, everything, the physical and the spiritual without distinction, was related to her passionate openness to life, which was ultimately openness to God. He calls this the earthy and embodied sense of the divine that saturates her diaries. Anne?
I was just going to say, she feels life, both the joy and she feels life both the joy and the pain at the same moment. So you can experience both, and neither one overshadows the other, but she has moments of feeling solidarity with all of life itself. So.
Thank you.
And I think that solidarity with all of life itself is the reality of Sophia, pulsing through all of it, talking about unveiling, you know.
Yes. Our bodies, the trees, the earth, even in one passage, the hard soil beneath the camps, which she describes pulsing with the whisper and the protest of life itself, enfolding us in her gentle and regular heartbeat. Eddie was no naive romantic. She felt the noose tightening, the impending cruelty and deprivation, the likes of which, she writes, I cannot imagine even in my wildest fantasies. Yet there pulses throughout her diaries an enduring sense of grace and consolation. She writes, quote, I don't feel caught in anybody's clutches. I feel safe in God's arms. To put it rhetorically, and no matter whether I am sitting at this beloved old desk now, or in a bare room in the Jewish district, or perhaps in a labor camp under SS guards in a month's time, I shall always feel safe in God's arms. All this is as nothing to the immeasurable expanse of my faith in God and my inner receptiveness. End quote. The key image may be the last, her determination to maintain an inner receptiveness that no amount of barbed wire or ideological fury could contain. Indeed, her journals reflect an inner freedom and faith that seem to flow much more from sensual receptivity and wordless silence than from any explicit religious creed or doctrine. She writes, such words as God and death and suffering and eternity are best forgotten. We have to become as simple and as wordless as the growing corn or the falling rain. We must just be. End quote. Her sensual openness to God, including her closest friendships and intimate sexual relationships, as you'll remember from her diaries. With lovers no less than with friends, family, and children, we must learn to just be, attentive and unconditionally present, whether in passing ecstasies, in evening laughter around the dinner table, or long passages of dryness and mutual loneliness. Such is the way of friendship with God, who shares our desire, our solitude, our companionship, our loneliness. 2 weeks before her internment at Westerbork, Eddie speaks directly to God, confessing her growing realization that the perceived presence or absence of the divine in the world depends considerably upon us, on our safeguarding God's hidden dynamism within the creation. And if somebody could read from the second passage on page 6. Yes.
Dear God, these are anxious times. Tonight, for the first time, I lay in the dark with burning eyes as scene after scene of human suffering passed before me. I shall promise you one thing, God, just one very small thing. I shall never burden my today with cares about my tomorrow, although that takes some practice. Each day is sufficient unto itself. I shall try to help you, God, to stop my strength ebbing away, though I cannot vouch for it in advance. But one thing is becoming increasingly clear to me, that you cannot help us, that we must help you to help ourselves. And that is all we can manage these days. And also all that really matters, that we safeguard that little piece of you, God, in ourselves. and perhaps in others as well. You cannot help us, but we must help you and defend your dwelling place inside us to the last.
Robert Ellsberg again notes that, like many other stories of courage and resistance during the Holocaust, what most defies rational explanation in her story was her willingness to take suffering upon herself in solidarity with those others who were suffering. As Robert Ellsberg notes, this was not a masochistic embrace of suffering for its own sake, but rather, as he puts it in a wonderful phrase, it was her vocation to redeem the suffering of humanity from within by safeguarding that little piece of you, God, in ourselves. Quoting there from the passage we just read. Does anybody want to respond to this passage?
Maybe you could say something about this. The sentence, you cannot help us, that we must help you to help ourselves. Can you add some more light on that? Is she talking about that piece of God, that in the next sentence, that little piece of God that we need to keep finding that within ourselves?
And preserving it in others, I think. To me, the passage is sort of a profound and painful affirmation of the burden of freedom. You know, that if we don't open circles of love and companionship and presence to one another, if we close the tightening barbed wire circle tighter and tighter, then God finds no place to enter. And so the burden of our freedom, the gift of what's called covenant in the Bible, that God depends on us, that God needs us to open those circles. God will not coerce love. That's what I hear. But maybe some more will come forward, because it is striking that just sort of it grates against our ears when just the admission that God cannot help us. What do you mean? God is all powerful, right? We've been taught from day one, omniscient, all powerful, and I'll reflect on that a little bit more. What about God's power if God cannot help us? Yes.
I mean, doesn't that mean that power actually is within us? And that if we're constantly looking for God out here, that's not where we're going to find God. Where we're going to find God is in here, and then we're also going to find God here, right? And that, in a way, I mean, like, it's when you hear people say, you know, how could God have let 6 million Jews die? Well, God didn't. Right, and so, I talked way. At any rate, that's just my kids have asked me this, and you kind of have to sit and think about this, and if we talk about, if God really is love, right, the real power of that kind of lies within us, because we're the ones who say yes to that, or we're the ones who say no. And it's a little bit scary at some level to recognize that power, and it makes daily life sometimes really flinking hard, because there's so many times you want to say no,
The image that comes to mind is the power of Christ on the cross. So our image of, talk about turning the image of the powerful God upside down. If the Christian God is dying on the cross, that's where the real power is. So the power of taking on suffering, the innocent, taking on suffering in solidarity with others in a pure offering of love. And that transforms suffering into something, into love. That's how I see it. And she's very Christ-like in those words.
Mm.
I think it also speaks to the fact that we live in a world that isn't like the Greek world, where God was all the omnis, and where everything was perfectly ordered. The universe was understood in a very different sense of order. But now that we understand that this universe in which we live is governed by law and chance and the interaction of those things, and by groping and choice making that God has given us out of God's actually infinite love, God has given us free will. So when choices are made, we are now co-creating with God. So that image of Sophia as co-creator, pulsing in our own very depth at the Pont Vierge, but also even deeper into the depth of the laws of this universe, speaks to that for me, that especially in what she was in the midst of and could see. And it made sense to her that you can help us, And I think it's very helpful to people. It does confuse others, but it really is helpful to some people who are really in the depths of what's my next step, or now what in the face of this.
It also reminds me of what Ilia DeLeo says in one of her books. Excuse me. God cannot move mountains. Our faith can move mountains. And what does that mean to us? Our faith moves mountains.
Maybe it resounds with that notion of fiat, of participation, that we're called to be part of. If I could repeat that insight, Robert Ellsberg, this wasn't a masochistic embrace of suffering for its own sake, but rather a vocation to redeem the suffering of humanity from within. Black or white, Jew or Christian, Hindu or Muslim, Buddhist or atheist, is this not what it means to live in solidarity with friends and strangers alike in the merciful womb of love? To redeem the suffering of humanity from within. For Christians, does this not describe the very life and person of Jesus? No matter how often I read the diaries of Eddie Hilsom, when I turn the final pages, I'm overwhelmed both with wonder and sadness. So much vitality, so much erotic warmth and humane goodness, snuffed out by the fury of racist ideology set into motion with a technocratic efficiency and scope beyond all imagining. Eddie's last known writings were scribbled on a postcard thrown from the train that delivered her to Auschwitz. "We left the camp singing," she wrote. It is not for me, let alone any Christian, to claim the victory for love and thus for God by Eddie Hilsom's witness. And yet an almost miraculous spirit endures and comes to life again in our remembering her. Here I want to linger just a moment longer with the striking feminine imagery that Eddie uses to express her sense of God's presence. Her arms round me so close and protective that she can scarcely distinguish it from her own heartbeat. Of course, Eddie is not the first Jew to express the divine encompassing presence in such vividly feminine terms. From the book of Proverbs and Wisdom to the wisdom sayings of Jesus and much of the earliest Christological hymns of the New Testament, the feminine face of God haunts the Bible itself, even where she has largely been marginalized or banished from institutional Judaism and Western Christianity. She saturates Jewish Kabbalism, so mystical Judaism, the mystical narrative which is called Zimzum, that is a Hebrew word meaning contraction, a kind of a mystical narrative in which God creates and nurtures the world not through sheer omnipotent power or a kind of a dominating force, but rather much more like a mother, freely and lovingly contracting her very self, opening a space in God's very self for the emergence of the material cosmos, and consummately for human freedom over deep, deep time. Paradoxically, it is the emptiness or womb-like openness of God's expansive love that sustains the ripening fullness of a vibrantly unfolding creation. Many Christian theologians and Jewish theologians have reflected on this imagery of Jewish Kabbalism. A German theologian named Jürgen Moltmann has a series of lectures where he reflects on this maternal image of God that he's drawing from the Jewish mystical tradition. But what can such feminine imagery have to do with racist genocide or the collective horrors of human history? Jewish theologian Melissa Raphael, I want to share with you just some insights from her book, a wonderful book, a breathtaking book called The Female Face of God at Auschwitz. Melissa Raphael. And in this book, she joins other feminist theologians in arguing that patriarchal or exclusively male images, discourses, and practices in synagogue and church have sanctioned a great deal of injustice, misogyny, and violence in society, in no small part by obscuring the female face of God, God's nurturing, indwelling presence known in the Hebrew Bible as wisdom, Shekinah, Sophia, or spirit. Patriarchal forces have veiled the feminine divine, she writes, to the point of disappearance, perhaps nowhere more horrifically than in Auschwitz. Indeed, it is not altogether surprising, she suggests, that traditional Jewish theology, with its own patriarchal imagination, could not conceive how the all-powerful God of Moses and the prophets would have been so utterly powerless, so impotent, if I could use a gendered term, so impotent in the face of Auschwitz. In effect, Raphael suggests that traditional post-Holocaust approaches essentially accuse God for not being patriarchal enough. It's interesting, isn't it? So the assumption behind the question, where is God, is of a masculine God who can and should intervene to protect God's people. In truth, Raphael argues, God was not wholly eclipsed in Auschwitz, but became incarnate in women who turned in compassion and bodily care toward one another, defying the most inhumane and desperate circumstances. With unsparing detail, Raphael unearths the largely ignored and forgotten stories of women in the camps who maintained the practices of Jewish prayer and ritual purification with whatever resources were available to them, not excluding their own bodily fluids where water was nowhere to be found. Within the barbed wire enclosure of the camps, one woman's body bent in compassionate presence over another woman's or a child's body formed an encircling space where the divine presence could dwell, where God could be reconciled with humanity, as it were, over against the patriarchal God of raw power, the false and idolatrous God of nation-states and of National Socialism. Even, or especially in Auschwitz, the most basic gestures of compassion constituted, she writes, a redemptive moment of human presence, a staying there against erasure, not only for women in the camps, but through them for God. Hang in with me, just a few more points from Raphael, and then we can take a little break. Raphael tells the story of a woman who, torn from her husband and children by SS guards immediately after arriving at the camp, falls weeping on the frozen ground with the flaming crematoria behind her, when she suddenly feels two hands lay a garment around her shoulders. An old French woman had stepped forward, wrapping her in her own cloak, whispering, "It will be over soon. It will be over soon." Raphael recalls another now iconic story of an old woman who is remembered, quote, for holding in her arms a motherless 1-year-old child as she stood at the edge of the communal pit, about to be shot with the rest of her village by Nazi troops. The old woman sang to the child and tickled him under the chin until he laughed with joy. And then they were both shot. Clearly, Raphael's case for the divine presence in Auschwitz does not hinge on numerical or otherwise logical analyses, as if hints and gestures of the good could cancel out the overwhelming weight of evil. Hers, she clarifies, is not a quantitative theology, contingent upon circumstance. It is a qualitative ethical theology, in which the truly numinous spectacle was not the horror of flaming chimneys, but the mysterium of human love that is stronger than death, the tremendum of its judgment upon demonic hate, and the fascinans of its calling God back into a world which had cast her out. Indeed, the sacramental imagination, as I would call it here, that's the term that I would give for what Raphael is describing, which I think we share with Judaism, the sacramental imagination which perceives human life as sacrament of God, divine instrument of presence. The sacramental imagination, as I would call it here, whether Jewish or Muslim or Catholic, is an impulse, she says, that, quote, attaches very large meanings to very small signs. Do you want to take a short break? Do you need it? Why don't we take 5 minutes, and I'll share a few more things. But it feels like a good moment to pause, take a drink, stretch. So about 5 minutes. Thank you. I just ended on a point about the sacramental imagination that, and quoting Melissa Raphael, an impulse that attaches very large meanings to very small signs. And I want to pursue that a little further, but let me pause just for a moment and ask if you have any thoughts. Anybody want to share anything? Or questions or comments at this point? Okay, shall I roll on? Okay. So I want to risk a personal example a little closer to home. So we've looked at Eddie Hilsum and the Shoah, and but I want to share, if I could, a more personal story. Several years ago, my wife and I adopted 2 children from Haiti. Immediately after our adopted son Henry was born, somewhere in the vast slum of Cité Soleil, which is this vast slum that stretches out over the center of Port-au-Prince. Immediately after he was born, his mother abandoned him in a latrine. We heard this story later. She believed she had been impregnated by an evil spirit. Now, those of you who know Haiti, know about Haiti, know that, as they say, the country is 97% Catholic and 100% voodoo. There's this amazing blending of the two traditions, Catholic and voodoo. And what happened to Henry's mother, I don't know. I've often wondered, but her belief was that she had been impregnated by an evil spirit. Perhaps she had been raped. That would seem to me to qualify. But in any case, she abandoned him in a latrine. We were told this story of Henry's birth when we held him for the first time at the age of 6 months in the orphanage in Port-au-Prince. We went to visit. We also learned that sometime after he was abandoned, we don't know if it was minutes or hours, another woman from the area heard his cries and found this tiny newborn struggling in the latrine, half submerged in feces. The neighbor retrieved him, brought him back to the mother, and insisted that she take him to the orphanage. She did. Now, the rationalist may hear this story and call it a happy accident of circumstance. I call it a miracle of grace, which brought Henry crying and fighting for life from one woman's womb into another's sheltering arms, and less than a year later, into my family's embrace. As my baseball player student said, you remember what he said. I don't have to say it again. Now, of course, for every story like ours, there are 10,000 and 6 million more that defy theological meaning. Even our story is haunted by ambiguities. Can grace rise from the horror of an earthquake? So we met our 2 Haitian children in the summer of '09, went there for a week and met them at the orphanage. If you remember, there was an earthquake in January of 2010, a devastating earthquake, in which somehow, again, by some miracle of grace, the orphanage survived. Not a single child was hurt. 300,000 Haitians lost their lives almost instantly. Since the earthquake in Haiti of January 2010, I have often thought of Henry's birth mother, and I pray that God has freed her from whatever dark spirits or abusive men that may once have overshadowed her. And even still, when I contemplate this beautiful child who came to us, as it were, to use a biblical phrase, in the fullness of time, from a chain of events and innumerable acts of other people's selflessness, well beyond my capacity to understand, I cannot help but fall mute in wonder. And so after the earthquake, the next 12 days were quite dramatic, including people on the ground, many, the nannies, for example, in the orphanage who brought the kids out and set up camp in the courtyard, who turned an old box truck into a nursery where all the children under 1 year old were kept in the nursery, so including Henry, who kept these children alive in a very perilous moment, a very perilous time. Within 3 days, there were armed looters coming into the orphanage to take water and milk and their food. The U.S. military, the news crews, within a few days, Fox News. I'll never say a good thing about Fox News except for right now. It was their crew on the ground in our orphanage that they went to our orphanage actually and brought attention to the plight of the orphans. And not long after, the American military came in, and there was countless acts of heroism in those 12 days when they, long story short, were all these kids who had families waiting for them in the U.S. were boarded onto a military transport plane and brought to the United States. So 12 days after the earthquake, we met our 2 kids in an airport hangar in Denver, a place that was, it was like the Nativity, but times 20. All these families who were greeting their children. There's a beautiful teaching in the Jewish tradition called tikkun olam, a Hebrew phrase meaning, tell me if I have this correctly, the reparation, the making good, the rescuing to make good of what is left of this smashed world. Tikkun olam. Yes? Thank you. The wellspring of tikkun olam is love received and love freely given. A fierce love that seeks justice and the flourishing of life for all God's children. Melissa Raphael, in her study of Auschwitz, gets it exactly right, I believe, when she concludes, the restoration or tikkun of the world, quote, does not occupy a quantity of space and time. It is the theophanic possibility of a moment. Now, what does that mean? The theophanic possibility of a moment. The fearful mystery of grace hinges precisely on the moment, the accumulated constellation of moments in which we and people we will never meet say yes or no to love, to compassion. The theophanic possibility of a moment. Theophany means what? A manifestation of God. Through our flesh, through our hands, through our feet, through our choices. Collectively, what such moments reveal is a picture of God's power as manifest in the vulnerability and weakness of incarnate love. She writes, Raphael writes, where the communal fabric of the world was being torn apart, human love was anticipating its renewal. End quote. Where racist ideology sought to obliterate God as God incarnate in the Jews, there were nevertheless women, and certainly there were many men as well, who, as Raphael writes, who made sanctuary for the spark of the divine presence that saved it from being extinguished. Here, I think, is a central Jewish insight which Christian theology has too often obscured. God asks, God invites, God needs our participation in the indwelling drama of love. We encounter that same flash of incarnate presence in Eddie Hilsum. The realization of God's own hope for the world, what Jesus calls the reign of God, hinges on our inner receptiveness, our fiat, our participation. For Catholics, of course, and for Thomas Merton, not only Christ but Mary stands as our model for the call to such participation. Thus, from the poem Hagia Sophia, through her wise answer, through her obedient understanding, through the sweet yielding consent of Sophia, God enters without publicity into the city of rapacious men. But we must never forget that Mary's fiat, her deep attunement to the divine presence, had long been prepared in her, as it was for Jesus, by the people Israel, whose stories resound everywhere with the call of covenant relationship in history. Note here how the word presence evokes a promise that is both spatial and temporal. And this is crucial, I think, always reciprocal. It's two ways. I am here with you now, in this place, in this moment. Are you? Are you with me? Are you here? Where are you, Adam? God asks Adam. Where are you? Where are you? I miss you. Not just with you, but in you, and you in me. That's the sacramental impulse. I want to work through you. Be still and know that I am God. Be still and know that I am a human being. And be still and know that I am the earth. A word about the earth. From a Sophianic perspective, the earth is the silent memory of the world that gives life and fruit to all. The earth is she who preserves everything in herself, she in whom nothing perishes, not even the smallest and most forgotten of creatures. And so Eddie Hilsum frequently describes a sense of divine presence consoling her from within the silences of nature, as in, quote, the jasmine outside and that piece of sky outside my window. Likewise, Melissa Raphael notes that when no person was capable of a kind word or compassionate touch amid the dehumanizing conditions of the camps, quote, inanimate natural objects could take on the functions of divine presence for women. And here she recounts Viktor Frankl's story. Many of you remember Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning, of a girl who told him, as she lay dying, that a bare chestnut tree, quote, was the only friend she had in her loneliness and that she often talked to it, unquote. When Viktor Frankl asked the girl if the tree replied, she answered, "It said to me, I am here. I am here. I am life, eternal life." There's that I am again. Raphael concludes, quote, if God has chosen Israel as God's vehicle of self-revelation, then such stories must tell us something about the nature and posture of God's presence among us. It may seem little more than a tree stripped of its leaves by an untempered wind. End quote. Surely the unraveling of the world in our times is bound up with our ongoing violence against and willful sundering of God. As Jewish theologian Rita Gross puts it, quote, when the masculine and the feminine aspects of God have been reunited and the female half of humanity has been returned from exile, we will begin to have our tikkun. The world will be repaired. Amen? Amen. We might think of other places today, mostly hidden and marginal places where the protest of life itself, of earth and a mother love's rebellion against cruelty and arbitrary violence, seeks to break through into a world increasingly engineered for war, violence of an unspeakable kind against women and children, and of course men and boys, and planetary destruction. She rises from the threatened rainforests of the Amazon River basin, not least in their mournful lament for the memory of Sister Dorothy Stang, a sister of Notre Dame who died defending the native peoples and the Amazonian rainforest. She speaks to us in The Mothers of the Disappeared, who danced together in the Plaza de Mayo of Buenos Aires, in silent remembrance of their missing sons and daughters, husbands and grandsons, sisters and granddaughters. She weeps and rises defiantly in the story of Somali Mom and countless other Cambodian women and children sold into the horrors of sexual slavery, often sold by their own families. She whispers to us in the resplendent Sophianic icons of the Russian Orthodox tradition, in Sojourner Truth's still electrifying Ain't I a Woman, and in the soulful storytelling of Bill Withers, the wonderful blues guitarist from the 60s and 70s, in a song called Grandma's Hands, in which he reflects on his grandmother's hands, singing live at Carnegie Hall in 1973. She sings in the musical artistry of Joni Mitchell, Billie Holiday, and Fannie Lou Hamer, and from almost every page in Sue Monk Kidd's resplendent first novel, The Secret Life of Bees. A wonderful book and a wonderful film. If you haven't seen it, the film is really well done, I think, where the image of the Black Madonna infuses hope into the life of a young white girl who has none, who has no hope. She cries out in the silent aftershocks of destroyed natural landscapes and in the faces of the global poor and victimized women and children of color. What binds these diverse narratives into one wondrous yet troubling mosaic is the affirmation of the divine presence precisely, urgently, and most intensely in those persons and places written off by conventional wisdom as inhuman and God-forsaken. Indeed, where conventional wisdom about the real world registers no disconnect between our complacent worship of God and the systematic violation of women, children, and the planet itself, divine wisdom cries out at the crossroads in protest, identifying herself especially with the little, the hidden, and the forgotten ones, and with suffering earth, the mother of all God's children. Neither blood nor political boundaries nor religion can contain the reach of God's loving presence. As Merton writes in the poem, "She smiles, for though they have bound her, she cannot be a prisoner. Not that she is strong or clever, but simply that she does not understand imprisonment." That line, to me, a singular flash of hope. She smiles, for though they have bound her, she cannot be a prisoner. And yet, we know that she can, and she is, too often, bound, a prisoner. Sophia is the divine child in us who refuses to be accommodated to the world as dictated by the people with watch chains, as Merton describes in Pasternak. You know, Pasternak has this image of the men with watch chains. These are the men who make the trains run on time, trains loaded with priests and intellectuals streaming north into Siberia for the Gulag, trains loaded with Jews into Auschwitz, or closer to home, trains lumbering into the sprawling GE plant just outside Louisville, loaded with metals stripped from the earth, running 3 shifts night and day to feed our appetite for new refrigerators and washing machines, or to build the latest generation of drone aircraft now swarming the skies across the world, piloted by some kid sitting behind a computer screen in New Mexico. She is the child in us who rejects the logic of the businessman a bit drowsy after lunch, who says over his steak and martini, "Look, kid, the sooner you grow up and learn to live in the real world, the better." She is the perplexity of a young Dustin Hoffman in The Graduate. When the husband of his ill-fated lover, Mrs. Robinson, corners him after graduation and says to him with utter conviction, "I've got one word for you, son. Plastics." Right. It's a great moment. And he, okay. Or if you're familiar with Peter Weir's brilliant film, The Truman Show. You know this film, The Truman Show, starring Jim Carrey. She is Sylvia, breaking onto the set to tell Truman, played brilliantly by Jim Carrey. So The Truman Show, it's about this constructed world, and Truman, he doesn't realize it, but he's living as part of a reality TV show. And the creator of the show has built a whole world, and he doesn't realize, but from the moment of his conception, he's on camera. And everybody outside this bubble is watching him on TV. It's a brilliant and beautiful film, kind of about, remember that image of the helmet that we live in, this self-constructed reality that is not real. And so there's a woman in the film named Sylvia who's watching on TV, watching Truman, and she wants to set him free. And so she tries and tries again to break into the set to tell Truman, to wake him up and say, this whole world is a fiction, it's not real. She wants to set him free. She is Sophia, breaking onto the set to tell him that the world he lives is a complete fiction. Sylvia's is the face that haunts him and will not let him go. So she gets onto the set one time and is shouting at him, Truman, trying to tell him. And for the rest of the film, and then they haul her off, of course, the police haul her off. And for the rest of the film, he's trying to reconstruct her face out of pictures from magazines. Her face just haunts him. She is the one who shows Truman that he is not living, in fact, because he is not free. Sophia is that spirit of creativity and celebration written into our very being, yet feared and starved for oxygen by an institutional church that seems determined to rigidly choreograph and control every move in the dance. After all, as the logic of clericalism goes, the people in the pews are not theologically trained. I don't know if that rings a bell with some of you. Hope in the key of wisdom refuses to accommodate itself to the Loctite logic of the way things are, as preached by the powers and principalities in society or indeed in the church. This is the meaning of her innocence and ours when we risk opening ourselves, our hearts, our imaginations, like Mary, like Jesus, like Merton, to possibilities hidden yet manifest right before our eyes. In Merton's case, I think, now I'm going to stand back and just offer some concluding reflections, and then we can have some conversation. I think the embrace of Wisdom-Sophia marked a protest against the flight from woman, as he puts it, wounding his own past. So Merton recognized, not until he was 51 years old, he had never truly loved or been loved, allowed himself to love a woman. You know, he reflected back on his Cambridge days with deep regret that what he experienced, he fooled around a lot, but he never truly showed his true face. And he objectified women. And it was only falling in love at the age of 51, I think you could say that love relationship with Margie, Merton experienced in his whole self what he anticipated and knew intellectually earlier in his encounter with Sophia, but he had not yet felt it in an embodied way. And so her embrace marked for Merton a kind of protest against, as he puts it in one journal, that part of the garden that I never went to. That he ran from. And perhaps a protest against a certain spirit that in the church, crippling the prospects for renewal in the Catholic Church, a wound that cuts ever deeper today. Now that's my perspective. What Merton would say about renewal in the church today would be really interesting, and there are some indicators we could talk about. But I think in 1967, 68, especially as he's dialoguing with religious sisters, there's some wonderful conferences of Merton in dialogue with religious women at Gethsemane, and some conferences he gave in 1967 that are really worth reading because they sound like they could be written today in terms of the same tensions, many of the same issues that we're still wrestling with today. But no less prescient was his protest against what he called the deadly seriousness of American power. Its Promethean grasping for life that plays out tragically, in fact, as a kind of addiction to death. Under a ruling consciousness bent on war and endless preparation for war, the Sophianic child and real children everywhere lay forgotten, dead, buried. Christian eschatology, or reflection on the end times, Merton suggests, in such an atmosphere of violence and preparation for war, becomes little more than the last gasp of exhausted possibilities, our secret desire to get it all over with. What does it mean then to live together with wisdom, with Hagia Sophia? Merton suggests that it is to live fully awake in the center of these contradictions of our times, yet to refuse to be defined by them, or to accommodate ourselves to them, as Merton puts it, like an essence fed into a computer. That's the real danger, is accommodation. To become well-adjusted persons, to the world around us. Rabbi Heschel, who Merton was in dialogue with, one of the great prophets and poets of the 20th century, Abraham Joshua Heschel, he says the prophets are the most maladjusted persons in society. He says, when I see violence in the world, I don't accommodate myself to it. I don't want to become accommodated. It still shocks me. At the same time, he says, when I see the sunrise, I'm not accommodated to it. It still surprises me how amazing, what a fucking miracle it is that we're here and we get to dance in this thing called life. And so that's the danger that and so what is the life of spirituality, of living together with wisdom? It's to somehow to live in the center of these contradictions and not to be defined by them, not to accommodate ourselves to them. For when I am at home with her, says the Book of Wisdom, I can take my ease, for nothing is bitter in her company. And this is what Merton, here citing Julian of Norwich, who he just loved, that phrase, Jesus our mother, in the poem he draws from Julian of Norwich. This is what Merton, citing Julian, calls the true eschatological secret of Christian hope. That's the secret of Christian hope. And the very heart of theology, not solving the contradiction, but remaining in the midst of it, in peace, knowing that it is fully solved, but that the solution is secret and will never be guessed until it is revealed. The wise heart lives in Christ. Quoting there from Conjectures of a Guilty Bystander. And just one last thought. As I was reading that, I thought of Merton's letter to Jim Forrest. It's a famous letter called Letter to a Young Activist, which begins with this advice to Jim Forrest. So Jim Forrest was part of the Catholic worker movement. He was a novice under Merton, but then left the monastery and became very active in the civil rights movement, the peace movement. And at the beginning of the letter to Jim Forrest, Merton says simply, do not depend on the hope of results. And he goes on to suggest that the work you're doing is very important, but you're planting seeds, and you're not the harvester. God will bring the harvest in. But you have to cultivate a sense of trust and surrender. The work you're doing is important, but remain rooted in prayer. If you don't pray, you'll go crazy. And do not depend on the hope of results. You're not a Messiah. And somehow God is moving through this history, this particular moment. We don't see it. We don't see the fruits of our labor. But if we can stay rooted in prayer, then we won't go crazy, and perhaps we can bring the next generation into a more hopeful place. So thank you. I'll stop there. And, so here it's 3:20 almost. So let's take a little time to reflect together, and then we'll take a short break, and then I am prepared to offer some final. We'll finish at 4. Yeah, we'll finish at 4. So, would you like to take a short break and then come back and talk, or do you want to talk a little and then we'll take a short break? Shall we talk now? Okay, please, your thoughts. And is the microphone somewhere nearby?
I'm wondering if you teach this material in class, what year you teach it, if you do, and is their response the same as what Kathy mentioned, or are there inner resistances?
So to the Sophia material in particular, yes. I do. I do. Occasionally. So it depends on the group. But right now, for example, I'm teaching a group of a seminar on Merton. It's the first time I've taught only, a whole seminar dedicated to Merton. There was a young guy in the class who has been quiet all semester, very, almost painfully shy. He came up to me after the day we talked about this material, and he had read the poem, and he said, this poem, I don't know what it was, but it really helped me. He said, the part of the poem where he says that Sophia greeted me and with indescribable gentleness and humility invites me to be awake and to live. Mm. He said, that was really important for me to hear right now. And so students find it, I think, very compelling, even if they can't quite understand. It's very strange material. The feminine God, the feminine image of God. I also bring in some music of Bobby McFerrin, for example. He has a couple of songs in which God is, he has a rendering of Psalm 23, for example, the Lord is my shepherd, in the feminine, where he changes the pronouns to she and her. So I try and come at it from a lot of different angles, and they are very drawn to it, and both the men and the women, I think, especially. They frankly admit that they've been raised with an entirely masculine image of God. I mean, that's almost without exception. And so the thought that you could imagine, or that there's even stuff in the Bible, they just have no idea. It's the first real immersion into that image of God, which is sad, but telling.
So is your decision to teach or not teach certain groups, that discriminating, is that purposeful, or does it just not fall in line with the classes you are teaching?
It's purposeful in the sense of this poem. I do almost always something with the feminine image of God. Whether I give this poem or not is a bit of a, I don't know. If you tell me I should, I will. I sometimes think maybe mistakenly that because of very practical considerations, that this takes work and time. You want to have time to really unpack it. And very often as a college teacher, I don't have, so I have to leave some things in and others out. But if you tell me I should do it, I will.
Yes. The idea that you brought up in terms of restoration and the impact of Sophia in the feminine, and I'm just really kind of curious if we could sort of discuss the role of and the attack on American Catholic sisters that who are engaged in the work of social justice and who are under scrutiny by the hierarchy of the church. So just kind of curious how other people feel about that after, being part of this today.
Mm-hmm. Well, you guys know a lot more than I do, but I think it's, in terms of the experience that's in this room, it's very moving to me, and I'm thinking here of Merton's conferences in 1967 called The Springs of Contemplation. It's a book that I didn't know anything about before I did my research, but it's the set of conferences he gave with women religious in which they were wrestling with many of these same kinds of the tension between the religious sisters and the hierarchy of the church. There's a chapter in there called The Feminine Mystique. So based on the title of Betty Friedan's book. So in some ways, 50 years later, in the Catholic Church, we haven't gotten beyond in some ways. I was going to say I'm very moved in Cincinnati, where I live. I taught a course last semester called The Black Catholic Experience. So issues of race and the local history of the Catholic Church, and where the women religious, the Ursulines especially, and the Sisters of Notre Dame, were doing incredible stuff on the front lines in a very racially tense and divided city. Cincinnati still is highly segregated, and just 15 years ago or less than, we had race riots in Cincinnati based on some evidence of police brutality and racial profiling, this kind of stuff. So in that class, when I just was, my eyes were open to the history of women religious in Cincinnati and their role when a lot of the pastors and priests and the bishop wouldn't touch it. They were there. These were young sisters, very, in their 20s at the time, 1970s. And it was just very inspiring. I don't know, but your question pertained a little bit more to the present. Would anybody like to share thoughts on how this material resonates with the present struggle, the investigation, and so forth? Yes.
Yeah, well, something I've been curious about is that I'm glad that you mentioned the idea of patriarchy. We've had sort of a very strongly patriarchal response to September 11th, and it seems like we're still sort of in the wake of, that's our last national huge, it attacked our vulnerability in a way, and we took that, and we as a society had the reaction that was very masculine, very patriarchal. We will not forget, we will find you. The rhetoric surrounding was war on terror, but there was no sort of, and here's your comfort while you're at home. It was, we're terrified, we have terror, we have to backlash. This sort of really opens up that space, at least for me, and I think for this conversation, to look at a more, a reaction that has more wisdom, especially since so much of the information surrounding the attacks was misinformation and the politics following. And it seems like we've really missed a lot of wisdom in our societal rhetoric. And I think that this opens up. I think the Catholic sisters are doing a fantastic, awesome job of spreading that wisdom. But I think we can see that more. So that's my response.
As you were talking, that notion of taking my ease when I am at home with her, I can take my ease. And I just flashing in my head was this drone business, the drone aircrafts that I don't, not to sound too dramatic, but I think the day when those come back to haunt us may not be that far off. I just can't, in conscience, fathom what we're doing with drones. And I think more and more, and this was true 40 years ago, 50 years ago, but our whole economy is built on the military industrial. People's jobs in my home state of Ohio depend a lot on GE and aircraft engines that they're building. And how do you extract yourself from that kind of systemic evil? I don't know, the further we go down that path. Jesuit John Deere, some of you may know of his kind of relentless and very courageous, drumbeat, carrying on the work of, drumbeat of peace, I should say, carrying on the work of Dan Berrigan and others. And for his efforts, he's been felt much alienated by his own Jesuit order. John doesn't know how to say things in a soft way. He's very much, but I think at the end of the day, John Deere someday will say he was right. He was warning us without a lot of ambiguity about the path that we've chosen as people, as a nation. Yes.
Two things about the male and female imagery of God. I was telling my husband this morning, I had seen this stained glass, that when you looked at the stained glass from inside the church, it was the image of God as male, like at night or something with the light going on it that way. But during the day, when the sun came through the window, it was female. And it was very interesting, and it caused a lot of controversy because people had a hard time dealing with it.
Where was it? Where was this?
Well, it was actually this was years ago at a sort of stained glass convention for churches and stuff, and people talked about it. I don't know if anybody actually bought it, but I thought it was an interesting way to approach it. And the other thing I think about imagery is because so much of the visual imagery of God is male, with the beard and the long white hair. And this is really going back like 30, 40 years ago. There was a TV show, Star Trek, and I remember they landed on this planet, and there was this astronaut who got stuck there. But there was a presence which they basically said was God taking care of the astronaut, and it was all twinkly the way Star Trek used to be, but it was both male and female. And I remember Spock saying, he loves him, they're in love with each other. And there are times when I need to get an image of God and I go back to this twinkling spirit, that has no real form, but it's there. But it had both genders in it. And it's like we have to change our visual imagery so people can, something that they could, listen to or hear. So it's just not this male. I think that's what really gets in our way.
And Merton, reflecting on kind of the masculine and the feminine in both men and women, that to come to a more holistic, integrated understanding of our humanity. At one point in those conferences, he says we need a whole new theological anthropology, kind of that acknowledges the feminine and the masculine in all of us. I lost my thought. It sounds very Jungian. And of course Merton knew the works of Carl Jung. What I was going to say was, with respect to sexuality and male-female relationships as you see them play out on a college campus today, I think this is really, really, really important. We still see these fixed kind of gender roles that are so much reinforced by the media that our students are immersed in, I think, and a kind of a lot of role-playing going on that contributes to the so-called hookup culture on campus, but that where men feel like there's a way of being that is to prove their masculinity and vice versa. And I don't preach about this. My students tell me about it. They talk about it, when we get into a discussion of sexuality and spirituality, that when they look for 2 seconds really honestly at at their own choices and, that the imagery that they're immersed in the popular culture, particularly music video, if you do any kind of an analysis of music video and along lines of gender roles, and not only gender but race, how heterosexuality, how homosexuality is portrayed in music video. There's a wonderful documentary called Dream Worlds. Dream Worlds, and there's several parts. The third volume sort of is a wonderful analysis by a media critic named Sut Jolly. Dream Worlds 3, a lot of libraries have it, which it's 1 hour, and you have to prepare yourself to watch it, because it just, over the last 30, 40 years of music video, the narrative, the single dominant narrative that dominates music video is the heterosexual male pornographic imagination. That's how, and it's just right there. And the point is that it's the only narrative. You know, the critic who did this documentary is careful to say, I'm not suggesting censorship, or I'm not criticizing the images of nudity and all the rest. He says the key point here is that there's only one story being told about our sexuality, about what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman. And that it's the only narrative. And he says, paradoxically, we think we have an over-sexualized culture. The problem is we don't talk about sex enough, about other stories, other narratives, other than this dominant one that's shaping our young women and men today.
But there's another dominant narrative, and that's the Christian narrative, that there's a male God, a father God, the father of a son, who is God. And all of that is certainly true. But there's so much more. And, you know, I'm going to cry. When we talk about the ordination of women and changes in the church hierarchy, we're really putting the church before the horse. I mean, the cart before the horse. Because I don't think we can seriously hope to consider those changes until we look beyond the male face of God. It is our only story as Christians. And sometimes I wonder if I'm a Christian anymore.
Thank you. Somebody asked me once about Merton and women's ordination, and it's always dangerous to project back onto Merton. What would he say? He does have a comment in that little essay, The Feminine Mystique. The sisters asked him about that, and I could share what he said in just a moment. But my first instinct is exactly what you said, that the deepest question, Merton is always reaching down to the deep question of image of God. What is the theological grounding for, and can women stand in persona Christi, in persona Dei? And the answer, obviously, is yes, of course. And Merton would have no hesitation, I think. You see it here in the poem. You see it in so much of this material. And so I think you're exactly right, that there right now we have one story, or a frozen imagination. And Pope Francis, for all the fresh breeze that's blowing through the church right now, this is one area where I think his imagination is still frozen, or at least in this first year, any indicator he's given to an openness, I don't see it. But the deep question of God, image of God, and whether or not women can stand in persona, in persona Dei. And if the answer is yes, then what are we waiting for? I don't see any theological case against it. Merton, at the end of the essay, it's interesting the response he gives. He says, well, Mary Daly, referring to her, certainly believes that that's the answer. Women need to be given the power of the priesthood and given the privilege and the responsibility of priesthood. He says, that's her answer. He says, I'm not so sure, because he says, I think the whole structure needs to be questioned, the whole pyramidal structure itself. So in a way, his answer is more radical. Now, was that a dodge? Is he sidestepping the real question? I don't know. I don't think so. I think he wants to go deeper to the root of the whole structure, rather than just plug women into places of power in the church. He wants to question the whole hierarchical basis of priesthood. But, if he had lived another 15, 20 years, who knows where his thinking would have evolved. But I think it always would go back to the deep mystical sense and theological question of God and image of God.
I also think when you use the word power, right, I think that's a word that needs to be redefined, because we have it defined within that structure, the pyramidal structure of the church, and that's man-made power. Okay, and so I think kind of we're really talking about revolution, which I think we are. We're really talking about real power, the power that comes from within, and that within, is where God resides. So we have to be careful. So we're kind of overlaying,
Right.
The female into the structure that exists is false, and it kind of needs to be overturned.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
I was telling the group here at the table a while ago that about what is going on in the church, about the changes in the church and appearances, that there was a wonderful church historian named Monsignor Ellis, who was way up in his late 90s, and he died some 8 or 9 years ago, who very cool made the comment one time that we were approaching a time when about once every 500 to 600 years there is a major upheaval in the church. And that maybe we are approaching or in one of those times. Of course, it'll take a glacial age for anything to happen, but we're approaching that time when there may be a major, for want of a better term, inflection point in the church, as there has been 2 or 3 times in the last 2,000 years. And it has come around. That's my point.
Just on that point, one of my favorite quotes from Pope Francis is, we've talked about this a little bit, Kathy and I, earlier, that he says we must not, in the church, focus on occupying the places where power is. We want to initiate long-term processes, and so what is he doing? He's consulting, bless you, so from the ground up, and this is a very Jesuit impulse, I think, you measure reality with the assumption that God is there. The Spirit is moving already out there. And so what do? I want to consult. I want to measure reality and, and then initiate long-term processes. And my hope is, or my hope, I suppose, or trust is that, again, do not depend on the hope of results, but hope for results. That seeds will be planted structurally in the church by the appointment of this and that bishop or women in positions where gradually over time, and maybe he'll have a John the 23rd moment where he feels the Spirit calling him to do something dramatic. We can hope that he has once he's consulted and taken a feel for the pulse. He seemed to do that in the case of the sexual abuse issue, where a few weeks ago he made some comments that were a little troubling, and then just yesterday publicly apologized and seemed to be getting it a little bit more, that voices are coming to him about the real depth of the crisis. And so I trust his method, and we'll see.
Okay,
I want to trust his method.
Me too. Just wanted to look at that phrase, taking comfort at home. And I wanted to mention, and also the question about women religious and the patriarchy and the Vatican visitation and investigation. And one of the places that I take comfort is that many women religious began to experience Sophia breaking through in our lives in the late 80s, the early 90s. And that excellent theological work was being done at that time. And there were many good theologians working, especially Elizabeth Johnson and the book She Who Is, The Mystery of God in Feminist Theological Discourse. Rosemary Radford Ruther in Gaia and God, and Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza. So, and many more anthologies. And so we got excellent theology to help us understand our experience. And I can speak from my own seat and say, when I began to have these other kinds of experiences of God, I was like, what do I do with this? And experienced in the beginning a certain kind of self-censorship. So I think that's something we can think about, and then how did taking comfort at home. Sophia break through. I loved when you asked that question earlier. What does her inbreaking look like in our world? And a good place to begin is, what does it look like when it happened in your life, you know? And what were the fruits? And I'm a spiritual director, and I see it. And when it happens, I just, you know, the energy in the room changes, and you know that someone is now beginning to open to that place where Sophia is breaking through, and amazing things are happening. Okay, then I go to the other place. So these are women religious who are now being challenged by the Vatican with the investigation and the visitation, who somehow found a way to find solidarity with each other. 80% of religious congregations simply put their constitutions in an envelope and sent it to the Vatican and said, this should answer your question about our life, and you approved it. And it was presidents of those congregations who were being held responsible and did that and signed those letters. And then nuns on the bus, and all of the amazing press that we got of stories being told in the secular press about the work that women religious were doing, as you mentioned. You know, and then I add, and it's not only women religious, so it's not only about ordination to priesthood, you know, but it's also women, you know, I just was kind of using that as my stepping stone in, you know, the work that women are doing, back to some of your stories too. So I think we need to help each other to keep telling the stories, you know, asking the questions, and reading the material, and having the conversations.
Thank you. In the back of...
I just wanted to go back to the education. I would not say you should. I'm changing. I'm learning not to say that. But I would ask you, isn't it Merton that says in one of his books, education, we teach nothing. We're not teaching people. We bring forth what is within them. So in that light, this is truth-telling. Why not bring it forth? Yeah. It might be the only opportunity they have. They're surrounded by war, violence, drones, whatever you... Computer is the big way to go now with a success. So who will soften that, if not at the university level?
Thank you. He has an essay in a volume called Love and Living, which it's called Learning to Live, I think. And it's for he wrote it for his alma mater, Columbia University. It's a really wonderful essay about what is a university education. And it sounds almost Zen. He's talking about this spark of realization. We're not filling people up. We're trying to spark something that's already lives in our students and in ourselves. So in that sense, the word educare literally means to draw out, you know, to draw out. And to me, you know, I think the Jesuits do this well, or any good liberal arts college attempts to teach the whole person, you know, so that our task is to help them identify what are the particular gifts I have to spark that realization of where do I, you know, come alive, what field really interests me. And it'll look different. There's no one way, no one path to holiness, to using our gifts. And the particular Jesuit genius, I think, for recognizing God's, helping people recognize the gifts that are already there, buried, and helping draw those out. But not the Jesuits alone, of course. But, you know, and that whole, the liberal arts curriculum, as you know, those of you who are educators, is very much under pressure, to put it nicely, to really diminish, to keep pushing toward the professional model of education. You give people skills that will give them, you know, jobs. And our students are under enormous pressure financially to to work, and in a climate that's been very tough. So this just makes our job a little bit harder, I think, to keep making the case for good poetry, good literature, music, art, that these are so important in shaping the whole person. Yes, we are. Okay. But this is so good. Maybe I have something I can close with, but it can be very brief. But I could also we could just talk for 10 more minutes. So.
Would you consider playing Bobby McFerrin's The Lord is My Shepherd? I mean, I think it just is a good flowing out of this conversation, if there's time for that.
Sure. Yeah. Could I play one other piece of music first?
Sure.
I want to share with you, maybe as a good closure in terms of, I want to go back to my son Henry and share with you a story about Henry. And even if I don't get to unpack this very much, I think it will be, the story itself, everything we've been talking about is very much implicit here. So, and this includes some music. So if we have time for Bobby McFerrin, I'll play that. If we don't, then I could play it for you after. I do have it here on my laptop. But I want to share just one quick story. Late one afternoon in the midst of summer vacation, my family and some friends packed a picnic and drove north to arrive. This is Sturgeon Bay, Lake Michigan, just before sunset. As we settled onto the beach and began to take in the moment our adopted son Henry, who was then 2.5, so I told you his story earlier, looked up from his food to catch the red-orange sun as it fell down toward the water. He ambled down to the surf, and after a few minutes playing at the water's edge, noticed the swirls of flaming light at his feet. Mesmerized, he turned his body and slowly raised his head, following the light as it danced across the luminous bay and out to the shimmering boundary where the crimson sun and purpling sky met the water. The rest of us sat on our beach blankets, mouths open, watching the scene unfold. As the sun touched the water, Henry raised both his hands to the sky, one of them still clutching his sippy cup. And then, I'm not making this up, he began to chant and sing and sway from side to side. For what seemed like the next 10 minutes, the child sang the sun into the water. I'll accompany this with a song by Eddie Vedder, who is a wonderful musician from the band Pearl Jam, one of my favorite songs called Better Days.
I feel part of the universe opened up to meet me. My emotion so submerged, broken down to kneeling, once less sunny. The voices they came, I had to somehow greet myself, heard vibrations within my cells, in my cells, singing. My love is safe for the universe. See me now, I'm burning. there for the teaching. In my head, see clouds of stairs. Help me as I'm reaching the future's paved with better days.
Just makes you happy, doesn't it? A quote from Heschel there, and I think there's one more image of Henry. But time and again we awake with a feeling of our wisdom being inferior to dust. We cannot endure the heartbreaking splendor of sunsets. And there he is with his favorite football toy. Just final thought. You know, what was he singing as he chanted to the sunset? What compelled this child who cannot stand still for 30 seconds to remain fixed in that spot and sing with nonsensical abandon to the surf and sky? Anyone watching might have reasonably concluded it was nothing, an explosion of random neurons, a flurry of toddler gibberish, but I'm not so sure. Perhaps he was singing what Heschel calls the forgotten mother tongue, the language of wonder and radical amazement, before he has a chance to grow up and forget. Maybe he was chanting his plain ecstasy before we, with our adult sophistication and sober reality checks, have a chance to teach such music out of him. A final passage from Merton, one of my favorite in all of his journals. He reflects on some children's drawings that were sent to the monastery from somewhere in Milwaukee. After noting that the pictures are the only real works of art I have seen in 10 years, he continues, quite poignantly, but it occurred to me that these wise children were drawing pictures of their own lives. They knew what was in their own depths. They were putting it all down on paper before they had a chance to grow up and forget. And I think that's perhaps what we've been talking about all morning and all afternoon. So I'll end there. And thank you again for having me. It's been such a delight. So God bless to all of you. Thanks.
So thank you so much, Chris. I said I should say something, but where does one begin after a day like this, right? Wasn't that absolutely exquisite, from morning till night? So it's certainly, I've been looking forward to this day for a long time, but it's even better than I imagined. So thank you so much, and I'm sure everyone here is really grateful. So thanks for coming out and being away from your family. I know that was a really big difficulty for Chris. We were talking, he's trying to figure out how he can be with the family and be with us. So, and he takes childcare very responsibly, right? You share it with your wife, so that's wonderful. So thank you again, and blessings on your work. Continue to do this good work, because it's so important for the future. Thanks. Thanks all. And thank you all for coming. I'm so glad. It was such a great group, too, that was here to receive the message.